Democracy. That's how they have been raised to see. So good.
This is a big event, even though the numbers aren't as large as we might have had, thanks to the weather. But by the same token, because of the weather, we're about 20 degrees more comfortable than we would have been otherwise. Let me just give a little quick background on this. This is part of a national movement to hold rallies like this, focused on not above the law, the theme not above the law, across the nation on the day that former President Trump was arraigned. Before I left home coming down here, the news was on where he had gone into the courthouse, pled not guilty to all 4 counts, whatever it was, and the game has started. I tried to count up the number of other rallies in the nation as of this afternoon, and I came up with 75. This is the old, well, there is this one, and there is now one in Decatur, up near Huntsville, that are the only ones in Alabama. As of the last time I looked, there were none in Mississippi and a couple of other states. I think everybody understands we're here for the same reason. This is serious business. The fate of our country is in jeopardy at this point. And I'm going to tell just a real quick personal anecdote about this, and then I'm going to turn this over to our main speaker, retired Judge Jamie Sledge. Almost 30 years ago, on Navy active duty, I was stationed in Bosnia at the end of the Civil War over there, when multinational peacekeeping forces had been sent in there to sort of monitor trying to put the country back together after several years of vicious, you can't even call it civil war because it went beyond that. But my job was to try to figure out what had happened there in a functioning nation that had sort of been a democracy, that all of a sudden you could have neighbors killing neighbors, tearing families apart, forcing people who were identified some other way out, if not killing them off, and completely destroy a country. And what I discovered was something that has frightened me ever since. It was not ancient ethnic and religious differences. It was about power. And it was about people who were interested in grabbing power, retaining power for their own purposes, and manipulating the general public to believe that there were differences, hard and fast differences between them, us and them, and that those other people were a mortal threat to me and my family. One of the ways that they did this, I was talking earlier here, Jamie and a couple other people about this, was to create words. So that when I went up to you and I said, "Bleh," that immediately identified me as belonging to one group. And if you didn't use that word, or you reacted to it negatively, that automatically identified you as the enemy. And it was things like that that were used to be able to turn what had been a very successful functioning society into a bloodbath. Ever since that time, experience in Bosnia almost 30 years ago, I have been worried about the possibility of that kind of thing happening here. And over the last several years, we have seen that kind of thing developing. What we are now in the process of doing is trying to hold former President Trump accountable for crimes that were committed in office. The closest we have ever come to something like that before was with Richard Nixon in 1974. And I was on active duty when that happened. And the longest hours in my life up to that point were the hours between the time that the Supreme Court ordered the Nixon White House to turn over the Watergate tapes and the time that the White House said, "Yeah, we'll do that." Because there was a real fear, and later I learned that that fear was not unfounded, that the White House, Nixon might refuse to do that, in which case we would have a constitutional crisis, and an effort to use the military, the armed forces, to prevent the accountability of the president. So we're all here for the same purpose. And one of the reasons for holding this rally is simply to make it visible and known that there are people in Alabama that do recognize that we got a serious problem here, and to encourage other people to realize if they think that way, they're not alone. Because it gets real lonely when you think you're the only one who feels that way. So we're here to make a showing, a visible showing, and to drive home the point that we're all in this together, and we all better work together to make it work. At this point, I'd like to turn this over to retired federal judge Jamie Sledge from Gadsden. Jamie is a veteran, military veteran of Vietnam, same era as me, way back in the dark ages. But also retired federal judge, and I want to have him come and talk to us from his perspective, because he has a depth of insight that I do not have.
Yes.
Does that work? Yeah, that's fine. Is this working? Okay, good. Well, one of the things that we need to know is what happened. What happened with the indictments that have just been returned with the arraignment that was held today. President Trump and his MAGA co-conspirators engaged in a criminal conspiracy to unlawfully overturn an election that they knew they had lost, resulting in a violent and deadly insurrection against the United States. That criminal conspiracy continues to this day, including the form of likely perjury by President Trump's co-conspirators during a special grand jury investigation in Georgia, and the tampering of witnesses during the January 6th Select Committee investigation. The Justice Department and the courts must hold Donald Trump and other participants in this violent conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election accountable. And that's what the goal is to make sure that this doesn't get forgotten, doesn't get overlooked, doesn't get covered, but is held accountable by all the folks. Now, in looking up this importance of no man or no person is above the law, there are many choices to make as to what our background is in this country. I found the State of the Union address by Theodore Roosevelt, which the address lasted several hours. So I will have picked out a few points from President Roosevelt's talk so that we wouldn't have that kind of time. But he emphasized that whenever either corporation, labor union, or individual disregards the law or acts in a spirit of arbitrary and tyrannous interference with the rights of others, whether corporations or individuals, and where the federal government has jurisdiction, it will see to it that misconduct is stopped, paying not the slightest heed to the position or power of the corporation, union, or the individual, but only to one vital fact. The question is whether or not the conduct of the individual or the aggregate of individuals is in accordance with the law of the land. Every person is guaranteed his liberty and his right to do as he likes with his property or his labor, so long as he does not infringe on the rights of others. No person is above the law, and no man is below it, nor do we ask any man's permission when we require obedience to the law. Obedience to the law is demanded as a right and not asked as a favor. The current charges are part of a pattern of lawless behavior. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that Donald Trump had to comply with the law when he was refusing to do so. At that time, and still today, it appears that Donald Trump is not familiar with the Constitution, and the Supreme Court in 2020 gave him an important civics lesson in two cases that were involving his personal financial records, including tax returns that he has long sought to conceal. But there is an important difference between being a president and being a king. As the Supreme Court emphasized in 2020, and on this point it was unanimous, reminded us all that the President may occupy the highest office in the land, but the President is not above the law. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the court's opinion in both cases. In the first case, Trump versus Vance, arose when a New York State grand jury investigating possible financial crimes issued a subpoena to the President's longtime accountants, requiring production of the President's tax returns, as well as tax returns filed on behalf of his various business entities. Grand jury proceedings are secret, and the Manhattan District Attorney has refused to say whether the President himself is a target of the investigation. He did say, however, that the grand jury is looking into the contact of multiple individuals. In the second case in 2020, Trump versus Mazars, began when 3 congressional committees issued subpoenas seeking tax and other financial records from 2 banks in which Trump had done business in addition to his accounting firm. The congressional subpoenas were issued as part of ongoing inquiries into foreign interference with the 2016 presidential election and the possible need to strengthen federal laws addressing money laundering, terrorism, and conflicts of interest. Donald Trump's response was to file lawsuits in New York and in D.C. claiming that those subpoenas were invalid and that he didn't have to follow them. He lost that argument in the lower courts and then lost it in the Supreme Court. The 2 cases, nevertheless, presented different claims, and the Supreme Court addressed them differently. Trump's position in the grand jury case was that he is absolutely immune from state judicial process while in office, and even as here, the subpoena solely concerned his conduct as a private individual unrelated to the performance of any presidential duties, and even if, as here, the subpoenaed documents are relevant to the grand jury's investigation to other individuals and organizations. No one on the Supreme Court agreed with that position. Since the early days of the Republic, as Chief Justice Roberts put it, presidents have been required to produce evidence in federal criminal proceedings. It was true for Thomas Jefferson when Aaron Burr was on trial for treason. It was true for Richard Nixon when a grand jury sought the Watergate tapes. It was true for Bill Clinton during the Whitewater investigation, and Donald Trump's compliance following the Supreme Court decision and other presidents in similar situations said, yes, but that doesn't apply to me. And he was not accepted by the Supreme Court in 2020. Indeed, as Trump claimed absolute immunity, his claim was weaker than it was in the Watergate case. Because in Watergate, President Nixon was dealing with statements and actions that occurred within the Oval Office. Trump didn't even reach that level of protection, which was rejected, and he lost that argument to the Supreme Court. The congressional subpoena involved a different set of concerns and a different balancing of interests by the Supreme Court. In a 200-year history of presidential compliance with criminal subpoenas, Chief Justice Roberts began his opinion in Mazars by pointing out that the court had never previously addressed a congressional subpoena for information concerning the president. He noted that that usually has been resolved by agreement among the political branches. But writing on a clean slate, the Chief Justice articulated two important principles at the outset. First is Congress's power to obtain information through subpoena is a necessary and important adjunct to its power to legislate and conduct oversight of the executive branch. Second, the power is to investigate is subject to limits to prevent a recurrence of the abuses that occurred during the McCarthy era. The most important of those limits is the requirement that a congressional subpoena be pertinent to the valid legislative purpose. Trump has argued that something more should be required when a president is involved, and again, the court has disagreed, reiterating the distinction between the inquiry into the president's conduct in office and his conduct as a private citizen. The standard proposed by the president would risk seriously impeding Congress in carrying out its responsibilities. And so we'd have the arguments being made by Donald Trump, both at his rallies that are held around the country and in his filings in court, which have been addressed previously by the Supreme Court and have been rejected and must be rejected again. And those arguments and those people who made those arguments must and will be held accountable. I have every confidence in my brethren in the federal judiciary that those appeals to the basest interest or basest position of people in our country will not be adopted and will not be accepted. We can have confidence that that will be true. Thank you.
Amen.